Hello everybody and welcome back to ChessDiagnostic. So today I'm excited to bring to you my next course, which is 28 Days to Master Level Chess Tactics. Now I've been thinking about this course a lot and I'm going to structure it to cover 10 main themes over 2 or 3 days, totaling 28 days. And we're going to look at 10 themes and they're going to be based around the positions from the Encyclopedia of Chess Combinations. So they're going to be very high quality, all from real games. And it's really going to help you improve your visualization and calculation abilities and pattern recognition. But more importantly, I'm going to go through the thought process and try to figure out how you'd apply it to solve each position. So in this position, it's black to move. And I'm going to cover a basic and intermediate position in one day and then an advanced position the next day. And then we'll tie it all together, hopefully in the third day, depending on the theme. So this theme is Annihilation of Defense, which we're going to look through over the next 3 days. And this is a basic position, and I'd like you to pause the video now and try to solve it. All right, let's get into it. So for black to move, what you notice first is the quantitative, which is the material aspect of the position. And you'd see that basically all the pawns are left on the board. Materials otherwise equal, with black having a dark square bishop and white having a knight. And when you see a position with this, you really want to use the strength of your bishop, which is basically the dark squares. And obviously the dark square bishop is cutting into this G1 square, and it looks like black has a little more activity on the king side. So you'd start to look for forcing combinations with your increased activity. And if queen takes g3 doesn't come to mind right away, you'd want to think about why that isn't so. So when you go for a kingside attack, a lot of times you're going to have to sacrifice a piece or maybe a pawn to try to open lines of attack. Because obviously pieces are the most important thing, and they're the way you're going to be able to checkmate the king. So queen takes g3 is the obvious move, and what you want to calculate, obviously, if you're giving away a queen, is how you'll checkmate. So pawn takes, what would be the follow-up? Well, you want to give space for this rook to come checkmate, so you'd play g5. And once you visualize this position, all you need to figure out is if white can put a piece in the way of this dark square, because he's going to checkmate, and the king comes up, this pawn actually blocks, the queen can get in the way, and the rook can get in the way, but you just take it. So at this point, black would resign anyway, but let's just see some lines here. So the queen goes, you take, rook take. He could try to move a pawn or even bring the rook over, but it's one move too late. You get a checkmate because the dark square bishop is too powerful covering this square, and the rook delivers checkmate along this line. All right, so this was hopefully not too simple for you, but it was a warm-up and applying Annihilation of Defense. And now we're going to get into a more complicated position. So this position is similar in some ways to the basic position. This will be the last position in this video, and it's black to move. And I'd like you to pause and spend 5 to 10 minutes going through a thought process where you evaluate the material, you evaluate the activity of both sides, and then you try to find candidate moves, possible forcing variations. And if you want to, I'd suggest that you write them down on a piece of paper so that you can compare where you went wrong, and we'll go from there. All right, so let's get right into it. So in this position, you can see that it's different in the first position from this video in that white is very active as well. And this is a very practical example because a lot of the times you will go with your own plans, but your opponent has his own ideas, and you might end up with something like this position where white has a lot of threats against black. If this knight wasn't here, he would get a mate in one, and he's also threatening to come in here. So that would be the first step in your thought process after you evaluate the material activity, is to see what threats your opponent has. And so obviously you can take that and keep it in the back of your mind, but then you go to your own ideas. And you always need to keep in mind during your calculations the various threats that your opponent has, because you might say, oh, well, I win a queen, but then you left, maybe you left a knight somewhere, and then he just gets a checkmate. So that's why I'm saying that here. Just a practical tip. In this position, we can just see from a general perspective that black has been very busy on the queen side, basically trying to get this advanced pawn, and he's essentially ignored his king side, which from that has allowed white to get a lot of activity. With this knight coming in, it's a very powerful knight, and there's really not a way for black to prevent knight to g5. So the first forcing variation, really, I mean, obviously you could see the contact between the bishop and the rook, but if he just takes it, then white might get something like knight to g5. So with this pass pawn, that gives you a lot of power. And when you see something like a pass pawn in the 7th rank, you should start looking at ways to reduce your own opponent's activity. So the first move in this position, we'll just get right into it, is queen takes knight. Getting rid of that potential knight going to g5, as well as getting rid of a defender on the queen side and in the center. So bishop takes. Now there's multiple moves here, but obviously just bishop takes the rook, winning some material. And now the threat is rook to b8, check, and then queening this pawn. But obviously the bishop's here, so you need to keep ideas like bishop to g4 in the back of your head, because white would just love to get rid of this defender. So let's look at some lines here. Let's say that white tries to play it ultra safe and brings the queen back, trying to win this pawn. Well, you can actually just go rook to c8, and now you're threatening. Now, obviously, if the king takes, you just queen, and you'd be up an entire rook. So queen to c1 would be forced. You could save your bishop, giving you time. And now, I would say in practical terms, your calculation could stop here, and you could see that the queen is completely inactive, and you can play like rook here and then bring the rook in, just trading the queen and keeping an extra piece. And also notice that the knight is covering here, so the bishop can't necessarily come back. And the bishop is also could go to g5, but the knight's covering there as well. So some very powerful minor piece coordination. Now, this is where basic tactics helps in these long and difficult calculations. And really the hard part is evaluating the end position. So let's go through the entire line. The bishop comes back, and now you could take with check, which you'd need to see. He couldn't just take the rook. It's check. And then after the final line, bishop takes, you need to evaluate that you have a rook and two minor pieces against basically for a queen. So that would be winning. And also he has this weak back rank, so he can't necessarily take queen takes. You just get a checkmate. All right, so there's some other pertinent lines we should look at. Now let's say instead of queen to d2, let's say he plays bishop to g4. Well, the knight can come back, and you really need to keep a knight there. Takes, takes. The bishop can come back. And you can see that he's blockaded. Now, this was actually a side line, but to me, this is actually the hardest line to calculate, because you'd need to be able to see that you can bring this knight in and eventually win the bishop and hopefully get here. And if he goes takes, then you actually have this rook sack if you wanted to keep it simple, and you're up an entire knight with check. There's a slightly better way to play it, but practically you could just play that and you'd be -5 ahead with an entire piece, and that should be the end of your evaluation. You could calculate it further once the position's on the board. All right, so what I suggest you do is go back to the original position. If you got any variations wrong, which you probably did, I got quite a few wrong, what you want to do is you want to visualize the variations now that they're fresh in your head, and try to figure out how you'd think about the position and alter your thinking so that it would be a little more accurate. Now, don't be disheartened if you got a lot of these variations wrong. It's a very complicated position, but you can learn so much from just one semi-hard to a very hard position, because notice that you come into contact with a lot of basic positions, basic variations within a complicated position. Now, this is why learning basic tactics is probably more valuable than learning very complicated positions. But of course, you want to practice applying those basic tactics, because as you play better players and as you understand chess a little bit more, you start to get these really complicated positions that just make your brain kind of explode and you get confused, but that's just part of the improvement process. So I hope this first day gave you some value, and I hope you follow along, subscribe, and I'll see you in day 2 tomorrow of 28 days to master level tactics. Don't fret if you got the solution wrong. There will be another time you can hear my lonesome song. Maybe when you here for a while. Subscribe and show me that you have some style.